So I'm going to just tell you the story. Just very briefly, I'm going to tell you the story of 3 enormous mysteries, 2 of which you know very well, and one of which I bet you've never heard of ever.
Okay.
Mystery number 1.
This is the one I know or the one I don't?
This is the one you know.
All right.
So, about 4 billion years ago, the Earth is one huge, mostly ocean of lifeless chemicals. And then for some reason, which we have never really been able to understand, lifeless chemicals suddenly produce a pulse. And you get life.
Hello, yes, I've just arrived now.
Nick,
Okay.
wonderful.
Like Nick, for example.
Nick Lane, I'm a professor of evolutionary biochemistry at University College in London.
Nick is the main guy in the story I'm about to tell you. But just to continue this setup, that was mystery number 1, where does life come from? Next, mystery number 3, to make it more interesting.
What about the 2? You skipped over 2.
2 is going to be the subject of the story. And, more important, the middle one is the deep surprise, because you've never heard of it. So I thought I would skip over 2 to remind you how familiar you are with 1 and 3.
All right, fine. Go to 3 and then come back to 2. It's
Okay.
fine.
3.
All right.
Consciousness. For some reason, one animal on the planet, and only one that we can know, seems to spring into this very elaborate sense of self-awareness. We don't know why it happened. We don't know how it happened. It just did.
Right. I'm familiar with 1 and 3.
You are. Now, here's number 2. That's the one that keeps Nick up at night.
Yeah, because there's a kind of a gap, a black hole, where everything important in biology happened, and we have very little insight into what it was.
Black hole in biology. I like that.
So you want to know what it is, this black hole? Yes, you do. You do. You know you do.
Okay, yes.
Okay. Mystery number 2. Okay, we're a little bit past 1. We're way before 3. So,
All right.
4 billion years ago, we got life. It's just floating around, little specks in the ocean.
Very simple cells, probably pretty much like a bacterium as we know them today. This is very small for a start.
If you're looking at the period at the end of a sentence, say, is it about that size or smaller than that?
Much smaller than that. A couple of thousandths of a millimeter long. So tiny things. They all look the same in their size and shape, and they don't seem to be doing anything very interesting.
Well, they were having babies, or they were using energy, and they were figuring a lot of things out. But if you look inside one of these little things, not much going on.
Yes, it's often described as a bag of chemicals.
They're not complex.
They're not complex.
Simple.
Simple as can be. And it goes on like this for millions of years, and then tens of millions of years, and then hundreds of millions of years.
Well, really 2 billion years or so.
2 billion years.
If not longer.
You just have tiny, simple, bopping, sitting, drifting in the water, bopping, nothing.
Come on.
No,
Get on with it.
Look, I'm telling you this for a good reason. You should know, there is no rule which says life has to get bigger. We could have stayed infinitely small for 100 billion years, forever, really.
Really?
Yes, really. But then, Jad, something happened.
As they say.
About 2 billion years ago, all of a sudden, practically overnight, a new kind of life shows up, a new cell, and it's huge.
How huge?
A lot bigger than what was before.
And these first ones, the actual volume were now around about 10,000 times bigger.
Whoa.
Massive increase in size.
It's like we just jumped from specks to battleships. And inside these things
Is massive pieces of complex machinery.
and it becomes bigger and more complex, and it ultimately leads to jellyfish, giant redwood trees, beluga whales, beluga caviar, which is baby whales.
It's not baby whales.
Well, never mind. Cherry trees, turtles, librarians, tarantulas, orangutans, elephants, pterodactyls. There's your second mystery. Like, how did life for such an enormously long time stay so simple, so dull, and so tiny, and then, boom, you get these big life forms? Like, what happened, and why did it not happen for such a long time?
Well, are you going to enlighten me with some attempts at answers?
Yes, but I want to remind you, this is a hypothesis.
I mean, who knows really exactly what happened? I mean, we're never going to find like found footage of that moment, right? We can only imagine, and we can only use the evidence that we've got now.
That is Ed Yong.
I'm a science writer at The Atlantic.
Ed's the guy who introduced me to Nick, or to Nick's work. So here's the important thing to know.
I mean, I think
during those 2 billion years when nothing much happened, it wasn't that life didn't get complicated. It's that life couldn't get complicated.
There is a barrier. There is an energetic canyon that simple cells find themselves trapped in.
What?
It means that it's a huge deal to try to get big. Think about what it takes to get bigger. It takes bigger cell walls. It takes more surface, more openings, let things in, push things out, more power, more moving parts. And then to make the whole thing fit and work together, you got to have a bigger design plan. That's your DNA. So you're going to need more DNA.
And all that DNA needs to be copied.
You're going to need some DNA copiers.
You then need to read the information that's encoded within it.
Some DNA readers.
And you need to use that information to build proteins.
And some builders.
And that last bit is especially costly.
In other words, you don't get bigger for free. Every new step takes extra energy.
Just like if you're going to, if you're going to increase the size of your company by 1,000 times, if you're going to have 1,000 times more employees, you're going to need to pay them all.
Where are you going to get the money? I mean, you and I, we might be able to go to a bank.
Yeah.
But if you're a teeny little thing, you don't have any place to go. So how do you get bigger?
I mean, can't you just eat more food than you normally eat so that you get more energy, so that slowly over time you get bigger? No?
No. I mean, well, you could do that, but suppose you don't have a stomach to absorb the food.
You make a stomach somehow? Wait, I don't know.
But in order to make the stomach, you got to eat more food to build the stomach. But in order to eat more food, you got to have the stomach, but you can't really have the stomach unless you eat the food, and you can't eat the food unless you have the stomach. You're stuck in a hole, kind of. It's a catch-22 kind of a thing.
Yeah.
You're stuck in what Ed calls an energetic canyon.
And to climb over the walls of that canyon and to start experimenting with complexity, you need something improbable to happen. You need something very special.
So special and so improbable that according to this theory,
over the course of all of our planet's history, that has only happened successfully once.
What? What happened?
Well, here's the theory. There's life bopping along in its boring way. Everything is very tiny, very simple. And then one day, 2 single-celled creatures start to drift towards one another.
One of them is an archaean.
Little blob.
And one of them is a bacterium.
Another little blob, but smaller.
They belong to the 2 great houses of simple things, the Montagues and Capulets of 2 billion BC.
In any case, these 2 little cells start to get near each other.
Slowly. What each cell wants is what the other one has to offer.
Nick imagines that, I don't know, maybe the little one was expelling some kind of chemical.
Let's say it's something like hydrogen gas, just for the sake of an argument.
And let's say the big one likes hydrogen.
That's what it wants.
And maybe the big one spits out nitrogen, which is what the little one wants. So they kind of come together.
And they snuggle up.
Totally ordinary thing. It happens all the time with cells, he said. But in this case,
that snuggling gets closer and closer until
somehow those 2 cells meet and they merge.
They just squish together? How do they merge?
Membranes fuse, cell walls don't always form.
Maybe the big one had a hole in its wall and the little one just fell through the hole.
I don't really know what the mechanism is. But we do know it's possible.
The point is, somehow this little guy
gets in.
The bacterium finds itself inside the archaean.
So that's the first thing that happens. One little guy gets inside another little guy.
Okay.
And I got to tell you, this is extremely rare.
For the most part, cells don't get inside other cells. And when they do get inside other cells, for the most part, it doesn't work out.
Because if you're this little guy on the inside, now you're trapped. You can't get to the things you want to eat.
It's cut off from the outside world, and chances are it will die.
Which is what happens, 99.999% of the time. But not this time.
If the swallower is capable of bringing in that outside world and feeding it, spoon feeding it to its swallowee, if you like, then it will work.
And maybe that's what happened here, says Nick. I mean, maybe the big cell had some kind of mutation that allowed it to keep feeding the little cell in its belly. So the little cell survives and thrives. Because the second thing that happens here is the little cell on the inside starts to divide.
So now you have, a cell with 2 cells inside it, and maybe then 4 cells inside it.
Which, if you're a big cell, is normally not a great situation.
You find yourself with guests inside you. Imagine having a house party and the guests won't go away. They're having intercourse among themselves, if you like, and producing more guests. There's going to be a riot. There's going to be a murder or something.
The point is, says Nick, when you get to this point, it really shouldn't work. But somehow it did. Like, not only did one cell get in another, which is rare, and then that cell survived, even rarer, and then divided without creating a riot, even rarer, but then somehow this big cell finds ways over and over of taking care of all those little new house guests.
And they're all stages of their life cycle. You got some old folk in there, and you got some babies in there. And how are you going to do it? Well, you probably need to. Let's put in a maternity ward first of all to look after the babies. Let's put in some kind of clinic for end of life for the geriatrics.
Somehow, this big cell is able to construct all this new machinery inside itself to keep this extraordinarily various group of house guests happy.
Wait, why would it bother? I mean, like, what does the cell get in return? And you said that it didn't have enough energy to build itself bigger, so how is it even doing this?
Well, now you're getting to the real nub of the story. The key here, says Nick, is those little house guests that are living now in the big cell, they're not ordinary house guests. They are a very specific kind of bacteria that we now call
mitochondria.
And if you look at the descendants of those little guys who live in us right now,
they have an amazingly strong electrical charge
that sort of radiates across the membrane on their outside.
And that electrical charge is, it's tiny. It's 150 millivolts. But if you shrink yourself down to the size of a molecule and feel the strength of the electric field right next to that membrane, it's actually 30 million volts per meter, which is equivalent to a bolt of lightning.
Whoa.
This is what the big cell gets back. This is its return gift. Lightning. And it's this new electricity that helps it fund all these new adventures and construction projects.
Now, they can support enormously larger genomes. So you can have, where bacteria may have 1 or 2 copies of a gene,
you can now have 10 more genes, or 20 or 30 or maybe 50.
There's no penalty for doing so. And what that gives you is a kind of a redundancy that allows different genes to do slightly different jobs or to diverge to, you've got the scope to experiment, to try things out. So you have one group going off to become algae and plants, and another group becoming animals, and another group becoming the fungi, and so on. The descendants did so well, they've taken over the world.
And they all came from that one single coming together, that one union?
Yes.
It comes down to one merger between 2 cells that made 1 cell, and then everything comes from that. You, me, the redwood tree or the hummingbird, a fungus, piece of algae growing in a pond, every form of life that we can see with our naked eyes, and many that we can't, come from that single cell.
And what this spawns, says Nick, is this is how we get the great tree of life that we see all around us. After eons and eons of sameness, suddenly we get this many splendored thing that is nature. And it starts right here. What we're looking at is truly the second Genesis.
Okay, hold on a second. Hold on. How do we know any of this actually happened? Like that all of the life that we can see comes from one cell. How would we possibly know that?
Well, starting with us,
Exactly the same ones in
if you go in and look at the genetic material inside our cells,
about half of our genes, a little bit less than half, we find them in bacteria or archaea.
Nick says you can see very clearly that the original DNA of those two cells that merged into one, they're inside us.
So their sequence and their structure has remained kind of almost intact for 2 billion years.
And just the structure of your cells alone provides an important clue. If you look at the cells of all of those things, if I take one of your cells and one cell from that fungus or from the spruce or from the whale, unless you were an expert, unless you've been trained in this stuff, it would be very hard to tell the difference between those.
In other words, all of our cells, and this is across animals, plants, fungi, they all look something like those original cells.
Very, very similar. They will have that nucleus, that's internal skeleton. They would have mitochondria.
Those are the lightning bolts, the descendants of that first little guy that got swallowed.
We have 40 trillion cells, and each of those has got, let's say, on average, 1,000 mitochondria. So that's a tremendous number of mitochondria in one human being. And the giant redwood tree has a lot more than that, and so does the worm. And so from that point of view, just biomass, we are about 40% mitochondria. So just from biomass, they are possibly the single most prolific life form that ever existed.
Okay, you got me. I do like this idea of like trillions of little lightning bolts in your belly.
I mean, it is also like, it's a little bit like...
That's our producer, Soren Wheeler, who chimed in as we were working on this.
You remember our guy, what was his name, from the floppy ears, the kind of
Richard
smart...
Wrangham? Is that the guy?
Richard Wrangham, yeah.
Life consists of finding energy.
That's him.
He had that thing about, he wrote a book a long time ago, but it was all about, I actually talked to him at the time. Human ancestors are going along, doing their thing, and they're eating raw leaves in the forest, same way that chimps do now. But then once they learn to cook...
Once you start cooking, there's a terrific advantage.
Cooking would break things down, and then then you don't have to break things down inside you, which means that you're putting less energy into your food, but getting more out of it.
Maybe it increases the amount of energy that you can get from your food by 25, 30, 40, 50%, maybe more.
And his theory is that is when we got smart, because we were in, again, an energy canyon where there was just, given what was around you and how much work it took to break it down to the parts you need, you couldn't do much until you light a fire underneath it and you, like a lightning bolt, and you break it down so that you don't have to do that work because now the fire is doing that work. Then you put it in your tummy and you get all the goods with half the work. And now you have time and energy to make a brain that can think about itself.
That is when the genus Homo, humans, in the first full flowering of the sense of that word, emerged.
Wow, that's interesting. So the energy canyon leaping theory might actually touch on mystery number 3 too, the consciousness one.
Yeah, but don't you think that cooking is an act that's intentional? I mean, when you decide to light the fire and cook the meat, then you're doing something that you intend to do.
Yeah.
What really gets to me is when you go back to the original pairing, I mean, that was just pure accident. And that so much would flow from something completely cosmically accidental, that's what really, really kind of freaks me out, actually.
That merger and the harmonious continuance of that merger was so breathtakingly improbable that only once did it take.
Nick says it only happened once, 2 billion years ago, and there's no evidence to suggest that it has happened since.
So there is no trajectory towards necessary complex life. The universe is not pregnant with the idea of us. There's nothing about the way that evolution has worked on Earth to suggest that complex life is an inevitable outcome.
And if this hadn't happened, would the Earth just be still rich with little, I don't know, life forms that are smaller than a grain of rice? That's all we'd ever get?
I think that's the idea.
Does that mean that you have to have this incident on planet Xantar and planet Xantar 36 and planet Xantar?
Right, so that's really interesting, right? So I think when we think about the prospect of finding alien life, we think the universe is so vast that we cannot be alone, that there must be life on other worlds. But I think what this tells us is that we will probably find life elsewhere, but it will probably be microbial. It will, the odds of finding something that, like the aliens that you would expect, right? So the odds of finding your Star Wars cantina are significantly reduced. The odds of finding like a bacterium somewhere probably reasonable.
Huh.
You might find life, but maybe it's going to be boring.
We could leave it right there.
But, you know, you probably won't get killed by them either, so that's a good thing.
That's true. That's true.
Yep.